Good morning, and welcome to the sixth part of our study of the book of Jude. Before we go further, let's just review for 1 second how we've been doing in the first 4 verses of this book. Jude, the half-brother of Christ, was not a believer and not a follower of his before the resurrection. But after he saw Christ resurrected, he became a very avowed follower and an apostle. And he, with brother James, who became the leader of the church in Jerusalem, became avid followers of Jesus. So he's writing this to the churches or to a church about what has happened or what is developing in the church when people who wanted to change the basic gospel, either by adding to it or detracting from it, started infiltrating the church and started changing the beliefs of some of the people in the congregations. Now, these people that Jude is talking to were Christians who had been sanctified by Christ, who apparently were followers of Jesus, and who he believed were his brethren whom he loved. But he was giving them a warning because some people, he says, ungodly men who have come into the church were trying to change the basic gospel under which they were initially saved and converted. This was not new. In his letter to the Galatians, a number of years earlier, Paul had written and asked them why they were leaving the gospel which they had been undertaken and which they had followed initially. He and the other apostles preached Christ crucified, and this was the basic gospel which the church was undertaking for the first number of years of its existence. But now Jude was reaching to the people in the churches to which he was writing this letter, talking about people who had come into the church who were trying to change the basic gospel. And he was giving them a warning, both for those who were trying to do this and those who were following the ones who were leading this change. And he used examples from the Old Testament as means of proving that God was not happy, would not be happy, and would punish those who changed the basic gospel under which they had initially been saved. And the first example he used was that of the Hebrews who had been rescued from Egypt in the Exodus. And it really applies to those who do not believe, who do not have continued faith in God. For these people were saved under the blood of the Passover lamb from the plagues that God put upon the Egyptians. They had been rescued from Egypt under the direction of Moses. But even when they entered the Sinai desert, they started to complain. They had no food, they had no water, they had no variety of food. Many of them said, why were they not left in Egypt, where they were apparently better off? And God said this in Numbers chapter 14, verse 11, "How long will these people reject me? And how long will they not believe me, with all the signs which I have performed among them?" And in verse 27 he said, "How long shall I bear with this evil congregation who complain against me?" Now when they reached near the promised land, there were spies sent into the promised land to see what the situation was. And when they came back, they all said that the lands were inhabited by people whom they could not defeat, whom they could not overcome. All the spies except for 2, Caleb and Joshua. And as a result, God really punished them for their disobedience. He said, as a result of their lack of faith, continued faith in him, he said this in Numbers verses 29 to 30. Numbers 14, verses 29 to 30. "Your entire number, 20 years of age and above, except for Caleb and Joshua, shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you dwell in. And in verse 24, according to the number of days in which you spied out the land, namely 40 days, for each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year, 40 years in the wilderness. Clement of Alexandria put it this way in his book on Jude. For the Lord God, who once delivered a people out of Egypt, afterward destroyed them that believed not. So those people who did not continue in the faith, who did not continue believing that God would continue to do what he said he would do, afterwards did not enter his rest or the promised land. All those who were 20 years of age and older perished in the desert before the promised land was entered. So there was a warning to those who did not have continued faith in God. He also went on to warn people who felt that they themselves were as good as God and could therefore change what God had said to suit themselves. And he used the example in verse 6 of the angels. He said, and the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Now, it says in Romans, in Isaiah 14, 12 to 15, how you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations. For you said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will be like the Most High. Yet you still be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit. In Revelation 12:14, he says, the tail of the dragon drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to earth. This is describing the fall of Satan, the fall of angels. And it also says in Genesis 6:1-2, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they choose. So we're referring to angels who have been cast down out of heaven because they tried to do more than they were supposed to do. They tried to become gods themselves. Lucifer tried to ascend to the Most High, to the throne of God. Other angels came down and tried to usurp powers that were not meant for them. God punished the angels. He punished them by putting them in chains, which were to hold them until the day of judgment. It's a lesson that if we try to assert ourselves to the point of acting like God, or putting things that are really ours, but put them in place of God, which means that we put other gods before the true God, then there is punishment waiting. There is a judgment waiting for us and for all those who do it. And those people who were leading these congregants astray by putting regulations, by putting features in place which were different or varied from the original gospel, they were actually putting themselves in the place of God. And those who follow suit. And then he said, so there were people who did not follow the faith of God. There were people who tried to put themselves in the place of God, And finally, there were people who just disobeyed God. And this is a third warning in the next verse. And it says, Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them were in a similar manner as the angels, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh. These are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Now the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is back in Genesis. And it says in Genesis 13, verse 10, Lot saw the plains of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This is before the destruction. It was a beautiful place, like the garden of the Lord. So, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities were in a beautiful plain, well watered, well fertilized, lush. And the people there were apparently very prosperous. In Ezekiel 16:49-50, it says, This was the iniquity of Sodom. She had pride, fullness of food, and abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. They were haughty, and committed abominations before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw fit. One of the difficulties that some of the men apparently were preaching to the congregants was that because of grace, any kind of sin was therefore possible, because of the fact that it would be then covered by grace. And this is entirely opposite to what the gospel really means. It says in Romans, should we sin more because we have grace? No, we should control ourselves and therefore not sin. Therefore, the people of Sodom were sinning because they were, one, idle, they were fairly wealthy, and they had plenty of time and facilities on hand. Therefore, their sinning became to the point, both in sexual immorality and in haughtiness, not giving to the poor, not giving to the needy, that God punished them. He punished them by destroying the cities. This is what it says in 1 Peter 2:6, turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, and he condemned them to destruction. These are warnings which are given to people and to us, to the churches, who don't really follow the basic commandments of God and who don't really follow the basic gospel. The gospel which the prophets gave was that of Christ crucified and of him resurrected. And this is the gospel which we should be placing our faith in today. Sometimes we spend so much time trying to interpret and change what has been written down that we lose sight of the basic fact that this is the gospel from which the church prospered and developed. Christ crucified and resurrected. And these are the warnings, the start of the warnings which Jude is now giving to the church, to those people who are leading others astray, and to those who are following, that there is a punishment and a judgment waiting if they do not follow the basic true gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you for listening. This is all for today. We'll get on to the next verse in the next session. Thank you. We'll see you next time.